The Cicatrix Maledictum, or the Great Rift, tore through the galaxy around the time of the fall of Cadia, when Abaddon or Abaddon led his 13th Black Crusade into material space. No, not that 13th Black Crusade, the 13th Black Crusade that came after it. Guilliman himself speculated that the rift formed after Abaddon had learned that strategically destroying worlds rich in blackstone, as well as what are known as blackstone pylons, which appear to be the creation of the Necron and may well be deliberately designed to contain the Great Rift, which I speculate may well be the original ocean which the Eldar culture bathed in at the beginning of the galaxy, but which was then subsequently sealed later as per their mythology, and perhaps due to some collaboration between the Necron and the Eldar after the War in Heaven. I could talk about that a lot more, but probably another day. Please note also entirely my speculation. Abaddon had spent millennia trying to find a path forward that would allow him to reach Terra, as he is obsessed with succeeding where Horus failed. His intention to open a so-called Crimson Path using the destruction of Cadia as its trigger. And it's best to think of Cadia as actually being some kind of great seal or keystone that he believed would then unleash the rift, which indeed it did. Many have asked, why did Abaddon crash the Blackstone Fortress into Cadia, thereby breaking the planet? Were there no other options? Why would he waste such a powerful, ancient device such as a Blackstone Fortress? Well, in essence, the fortress was already in ruin. It had undergone a boarding action by the Loyalists, and in what was basically desperation at that point, Abaddon decided that things were looking uncertain. He couldn't afford for the efforts of this campaign to then leave Cadia intact, and he needed to score a big win against the Imperium. So he decided to go all in, double down, and threw the Blackstone Fortress like a meteor at the planet. It still scored the traitors a net gain in the big picture. It seems likely, though, that this alone was not the singular trigger for opening the Great Rift. It has been since discussed as being likely a culmination of events which all compounded the instability between the material and immaterial realms. Not least the birth of the Eldar god of the dead, Ennead, which undoubtedly caused massive warp disturbance, also the return of Primarch Guilliman, whose emergence to lead the Imperium at such a time of disruption undoubtedly bristled the nerves of those who exist in the Immaterium. Having one of the Emperor's sons active once again to steer humanity is no small thing, and not something anyone has seen for a long time. And then of course, yes, the use of Blackstone Fortresses and continuing crusades by Abaddon out of the Eye of Terror. Some even speak about Magnus having had a hand in things. One of the core issues that emerged for the Imperium after the violent opening of the Great Rift was administrative organisation. Systems were now cut off, and worse, nearly every active Imperial war zone had to devise and enforce its own chronological system. In honesty, even despite the Cicatrix Maledictum, this was a realisation long overdue, as the sheer interstellar distances within the Imperium had long made any accurate recording and documentation of time and space a largely wishful thinking affair. This is one of the reasons why we must remain continually open-minded as to just what happens where and with who in the history of the Imperium. For very often, events that we believed to hold a specific order in a chronological timeline may in fact be anything but. And so, despite what many had presumed had been based on chronological descriptions given after the return of Guilliman, me included, it became widely debated that the current date for the Imperium should have now been M42. This was in fact incorrect, and the time period still remains M41 for the Imperium. How was this discovered? Despite the seeming stability of the old date system, it soon was apparent that it had become easy for dates and times to lose all meaning between star systems. Again, it's somewhat surprising this was not addressed sooner, like a lot sooner. But that I guess speaks to how stagnant and inflexible the Imperium was and remains. There are many references in material where the Administratum would receive urgent calls for assistance as an Imperial world is being descended upon by vast amounts of Xenos. The deals that have been made, the favours called in and prices paid to have that request elevated, and to have merely reached that point must have cost a painfully unpleasant price. Too high a price to even consider. And then bleakly, the scribe or administratum member who would finally see this would also then realise that the requests were centuries out of date, into the fire it goes, onward to the next request of that day. This kind of miserable dystopia in the Imperium remains one of my absolute favourite bleak pivots when it comes to the state of the Imperium. For all their golden statues of Astartes, tales told, myths, legends, still countless worlds are being besieged continuously, entirely out of sight and out of mind. Vast reams of critical STC information, probably discarded, destroyed by feral tribes who didn't know any better, menial scribes discounting essential intelligence that had not been stamped with the correct administrative approvals, and consequently, planets of billions are devoured. This is the reality of the Imperium, grinding, creaking, suffering, slowly collapsing upon itself. And then you have this dark stagnation juxtaposed against the immense light of the Emperor's Imperial Astartes. And so it was of course Roboute Guilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium, who made the first steps to resolve this one painfully problematic issue. After a long conference with his historiators and the mysterious organisation of the Ordo Chronos, he decreed that a single logic could no longer be applied to time and space within the Imperium. Through the then Highlands of Terror, he made his theory and resultant process into law. But even if it had been possible before, in the current age there could be no unified calendar with so much temporal distortion occurring. Even though the rift's warping effects might not have reached the farthest planets out at the galactic rim, its psychic echoes and the obfuscation of the Astronomicon were felt profoundly on outer worlds. Therefore, it made some sense, although simultaneously added additional confusion to Imperial record keeping to implement Guilliman's new decree that each subsection of the Imperium would maintain its own chronology, all of which would then use the coming of the Great Rift in that sector as its reference point. So this means that chronological record keeping across the entire galaxy is now even more complex than it were before, although it's also probably more realistic and slightly more accurate, but also confusing and difficult, and more akin to how it might actually be to try and manage some kind of galactic empire. The Cicatrix Maledictum became an unsurprisingly defining event for a new era of the Imperium. It remains a very complex situation, and any solutions or conclusions regarding its long-term impact or practical options to seal the tear were far from clear. Suffice to say though, the arrival of the Rift was devastating for the Imperium. It split the galaxy with those segmentum able to see the light of the Astronomicon on one side and those who could not on the other. The majority of segmentum obscurus and ultima are consequently now referred to as the Dark Imperium, Imperium Nihilus. The remaining territory of the Imperium existing in the light of the Astronomicon is referred to in the late period of M41 as Imperium Sanctus. This consists of segmentum solar, pacificus and tempestus, less than half of the Ultima Segmentum and a fraction of Obscurus. Life and travel within the Dark Imperium, Nihilus, remains extremely dangerous. Astropathic communication is difficult or just not possible, and the many enemies of humanity saw this opportunity to now continually besiege isolated worlds. While Imperium Sanctus stands in a far stronger position, it also suffers from a litany of persistent threats, but these are nothing compared to those of Imperium Nihilus. For this reason, it was deemed critical by Roboute Guilliman to forge a stable access point through the disturbance of the Cicatrix Maledictum and enable a continual mass transit of Imperial fleets between the two regions to support further campaigns. But it begs the question, what is in fact the Nachmund Gauntlet? Well, this so-called Gauntlet was discovered soon after the Rift tore through the galaxy. It stands as an anomalous warp corridor bridging the rift in space from Vigilus to the planet of Sanguine Terra in the Imperium Sanctus. It exists as one of the few stable channels connecting the two imperial domains. But why it exists at all is not understood. Some of course believe it to be the work of the Emperor's will, that he somehow parted the seas of the storm to allow his faithful to travel and fight the good fight. Toward the galactic northern end of the warp corridor stood the world of Vigilus, an immense bastion world of loyal Imperials, massive hives and industry. Upon entering the corridor, however, you soon come upon the world of Daravar, a stronghold of ancient Imperial knights who, before the dust had even settled after the emergence of the Rift, had turned traitor and aligned themselves with Chaos. There are other industrial and bastion worlds dotted throughout the Gauntlet itself, and finally you reach the fortress world of Sanguine Terra. Imperial astrocartographers continue though to struggle to agree on safe or stable routes through the Gauntlet, mainly because they're changing all the time. The danger and anomalous nature of the space throughout the corridor is always shifting, making traversing the Gauntlet one of the most dangerous crossings in the galaxy. But the very existence of the Nachmund Gauntlet I have found leads immediately to further questions regarding the nature and necessity of such a corridor. If you have galactic warp travel, why is this corridor necessary at all? Well, I'll tell you. I've found quite often that in discussing the events of Vigilus, Arcs of Omen, the Nachmund Gauntlet, there's a common confusion about warp travel in the 40k verse, and to be fair, it's entirely understandable, but consequently confusion arises around the concept of both the Great Rift and such a thing as a corridor gauntlet crossing this region of space. And I'll very often see questions like, why is it a thing at all? Can't you just enter the warp and choose where you wish to go and then you come out the other side? You would just be able to go around this Great Rift because the galaxy is not on a single plane. You don't just put a barrier up and you can't go through it. Or alternatively, another viewpoint is, can't you just travel around the rift? The answer to both of these is essentially no. First of all, you have to understand just how big the rift is, and yes, also, it does exist in the three-dimensional sense. It's so vast that it would be basically impossible to travel around and traverse with traditional power, and then you can't warp around it either. But I think the confusion mainly seems to arise from the fact that many people are obviously well versed in broader fictional space narratives, and so have built up in their minds something that we might call the mainstream of science fiction answer when it comes to travelling faster than light from one point in real space to another. So it's completely understandable, but brings a lot of misunderstanding about how warp travel functions in the 40k verse. And one of the most important things to understand is that the warp is something of a mirror of reality, but not in a very literal sense. The first thing though to understand is that travel doesn't occur at a single point. In many ways it's far more linear just in terms of going from point to point. So in that sense it's more akin to travelling through a wormhole or hyperspace than concepts that are more like folded space, travelling between 2 points in a galaxy without moving. The classic overused illustration of a folded piece of paper and a pencil. So yet again, sorry fans of Event Horizon who want to try and make it a 40k thing, they got it wrong. It's not how warp travel works in 40k. Because in the 40k verse, the shortest distance between 2 points is not 0. In Event Horizon, the ship creates a dimensional gateway that allows the ship to travel between 2 points in the galaxy instantaneously. Similarly also to navigators in Dune who would fold space and the ships will travel without moving. This is not how it works in 40k. Warp travel is still faster than travelling in real space. In fact, it's faster by significant orders of magnitude that without it would make any galactic empire basically impossible. But the key thing is that you must still travel. So in 40k, the shortest distance between 2 points is not 0. It is in fact a straight line. However, you rarely can travel in a straight line, because that straight line is rarely straight because you're in the warp. And in the warp, there's no logic or ordinary boundaries. So in theory, could you just enter the warp at one point and exit on the other side of the galaxy in, say, a day's travel? Theoretically, yes. Is that how it generally seems to function on the whole? No. Usually, when ships travel the warp, the time spent within the warp reduces significantly the time that it would take in real space from many thousands of years to mere days or weeks, sometimes years. Lost ships have disappeared for centuries or longer, and the warp is dangerous for a variety of reasons, some being very obvious, some being very obscure, some that create troubling philosophical questions, such as the fact that some ships may enter the warp and arrive at their destination before they even left their original starting position, meaning they somehow now technically exist at 2 points in the galaxy simultaneously. That's a very problematic thing. But the more standard confusion overall that seems to arise is this concept that both ships will enter and exit the warp wherever you wish in the galaxy. As I said, there are instances where ships may travel far further or become lost, thrown out far from their intended destination. But it's not really true to say that regardless of distance, warp travel functions by just entering at point A and choosing point B, be that anywhere else in the galaxy, and then you just wait to arrive. I think that notion stems from concepts more like hyperspace, where you enter this alternate dimension that allows faster travel, you enter the coordinates you want to get to, and then just wait. Again, not really how it works in 40k. So how does it work, and why do we know this to be true? Well, we know it because it's been very steadily, consistently documented through the lore, unsurprisingly. I recommend some small notes from the Solar War, Navis Primer, as well as Battlefleet Gothic. And as we know, travelling through the warp allows you to travel outside of normal time in real space. Thus, you will arrive at your destination faster. But it's not like hyperspace. It's not just a dimensional space where you can go anywhere. It's more like an immense tempest of an ocean, which is so severe that when you enter, your options at one point are probably very severely limited. You might only have a few choices as to where you can safely navigate, and that route will likely determine your destination. This is not to say that a single entry point predetermines a single exit point of travel. It just might mean that you initially may need to travel elsewhere to then access additional routes. In that sense, you might think of it more akin to a road network in some respects. Now, over time, as with our own oceans in the ancient times, routes have been recorded, charted that were generally safer and more efficient to use, so that steadily in connecting these routes, ships were able to then remain in the warp for longer. But you might still need to exit warp space and travel within a system and then re-enter at another position to access a different warp route. This means that some systems have critical strategic importance in the Imperium for this very reason. Now, hopefully that helps a little to explain the confusion around a ship entering a point and exiting anywhere they wish in the galaxy, but there's a little more to it. It's not technically as simple as that, but it is possible that some ships may be able to enter and navigate a very complex route through the warp to emerge at a whole other segmentum far across the galaxy. But actually navigating through the warp in a 3D sense has been very, very rarely illustrated. But there was in fact one example that illustrates how travelling the Nachmund Gauntlet could appear. And here you can see that it appears as a massive wormholes, conduits, all creating routes from an entry point at either end. So what you then have to understand is that it's obviously easier to enter at one of these entry points than just to translate and merge in halfway along and try to find your bearings. You could do it, but it's probably more unstable, more dangerous. It's going to be more challenging. And then also imagine that all of these routes are shifting slightly all of the time. So if you don't enter at that key entry exit point, if you come in the middle, where ordinarily there is a route, there may not be when you actually translate into there. Worse still, if you choose to translate into the warp anywhere and not at some of the designated charted routes, there could be an immense storm that alters them significantly or closes it altogether. So you can start to understand how difficult and strange travelling in the warp is, besides all of the demonic and ethereal entities that are trying to destroy you. In fact, some navigators have even been said to refuse translation in and out of the warp at non-designated positions because of just how dangerous it is. So that brings us really to the Mandeville points. What's a Mandeville point? Mandeville point is the supposed safe distance where a ship may enter or exit the warp. This tends to be the edge of a star system. Now, these don't appear to be standardized, but they are seen as invisible lines which mark the safe distance required to enter or exit the warp. Were you to arrive inside of that point, the competing forces of reality and paradox may simply tear a vessel apart. Navigators call this rebirth death. Established systems will have navigation buoys or reliably charted points that designate where is safest to translate from the warp back into reality. So again, it's not really true to say that you can just choose when you want to go into the warp and where you come out of it. Although it's not always made clear that that is how it functions, it's more specific than you might imagine. And it really is about charted routes. You go to this coordinate, you enter, and then your navigator can navigate through to various exit points, which are also charted and coordinated. What this means though for ships in the Imperium is that they have to use standard propulsion from a system's edge to a planet and back again. And very often this can mean that even for the fastest ships, it can require a journey of several days to actually reach a world. This is one of those lore technicalities where it may look epic for a huge fleet to pour from the warp almost in the orbit of a planet, but it's not really how it's supposed to work. There's also in fictional reasons why this is a good thing. It means that actual defences in between planets and surrounding a system on charted routes can be established, which makes sense and is strategically interesting because you have some opportunity to engage with the enemy before they actually arrive at a world. But there are exceptions. Warp gates, or specifically within the primary bastion of humanity, the Sol system, there exist the chthonic gates. Essentially, a warp gate enables stable travel, which is obviously very unusual. But in the case of more standard warp gates, these are mostly between two specific points only. The benefit of warp gates is that they avoid the dangers of warp translation, and so enable ships to enter a system far closer than they may otherwise need to do so if using a standard Mandeville point. The chthonic gates in the Sol system, as far as we know, simply enable ships travelling from elsewhere to translate further into the Sol system. How this was achieved though, or how they function, is entirely unknown, because they originate from the Dark Age of technology, and humanity has long lost the level of knowledge required to begin to understand this. Overall, be they of Xenos origin or otherwise, warp gates hold immense strategic importance for both safety and time saved in space travel. And then you have the Astronomicon. This is essentially a psychic lighthouse built upon Terra, fueled by psychers controlled by the Emperor, which forms a beacon for navigators to use as a point of reference to chart from. Without it, warp travel would effectively become near to impossible, or best case extremely dangerous. Because Terra is located in the galactic west of the galaxy, the Astronomicon only reaches some of the known galaxy. This means in the galactic far east, it is far dimmer or even unable to be seen at all, similarly on the very edge of the galaxy. This makes warp travel in these regions far more dangerous, and it's also the reason why it's not correct to say that the Tyranids saw the Astronomicon from beyond our own galaxy. That's simply not possible. But it is the reason why the Tyranids are believed to now be driving towards Terra. That's a technicality that is often misrepresented. Of course, with the Great Rift, this immense warp storm blocked the light of the Astronomicon, meaning that all travel within the Dark Imperium Nihilus is extremely dangerous and difficult, thus making the Imperium's efforts to reach this area of the galaxy and establish some kind of support all the more challenging. Some may even suggest it to be impossible now. There is, though, no such thing as a routine warp voyage, for even the shortest jump is a dangerous undertaking. For a navigator guiding a vessel along uncharted routes, the risks increase considerably. Now, during the Heresy, some access points in their nearby planets became key battlegrounds, not to mention things like the Chthonic Gates, which were also embroiled in the conflict, although ultimately didn't prove decisive in the arrival of the traitors. But all of this is why locating a warp corridor such as the Nachmund Gauntlet becomes absolutely vital when powerful warp storms cut off access to an entire region. In the galaxy even now, some permanent warp storms prevent access to other regions. One of the best known examples is that of the Coronus Expanse, which can only be accessed via the Coronus Passage, this warp corridor known as the Maw. And despite the immense danger, many ships which brave the corridor to reach the system on the other side, but traversing the Maw is so hazardous many ships are just lashed to pieces by unknown forces and never seen again. So when it comes to entering the warp, it's not necessarily a wise idea to just enter at any point. Can you technically do so? Yes. But it's not advisable, and sometimes a navigator could even override a captain if they believe such an action to be risking the loss of all. For any chance of surviving warp travel across the galaxy, you need specifically charted routes, competent navigators, the light of the Astronomicon, and favourable tides of the warp. So it's absolutely not as simple as just entering wherever you want to and exiting far, far away. One adjacent other thing to briefly mention, there are other methods of fast and light travel in the 40k verse, such as the Eldari or the Old One's Webway. This exists outside of the warp and is considerably safer, but it's too much to mention in detail here. But basically, there are other means of travelling faster than light across the galaxy which don't require going through literal hell. But overall, that's really the basics of warp travel. It's ultimately, in many ways, still not completely clear just how all this works, which is no surprise because there's plenty in the 40k verse which fits that description. And when it's something as vague and mysterious as warp travel, it's no surprise there either. But there is a reason why it's called the Sea of Souls. For the void space of the warp is a savage ocean, and seemingly where you can enter has a significant bearing as to your chances of survival and success, and then you still have to navigate through hell. Safe and efficient point of entry, charting a course, avoiding dangerous currents and storms that would trap and quickly destroy your vessel, all fall upon the navigators assigned to a vessel to determine, an individual whose entire being is spent knowing, feeling and learning about the warp, and establishing safe routes through and around devastating warp storms, and I've discussed navigators previously, see the link below. But again, hopefully this makes it somewhat clearer. You don't travel instantly from one point to any other in the 40k verse. You don't enter the warp and just travel to your destination. It's a very involved, challenging process of navigating routes and courses to reach an ultimate destination. And in some instances, even using the warp could take still many months, even years. And if a warp storm is disrupting your route, you might not actually be able to reach a system at all. And this is in fact how some systems have ended up being cut off from the Imperium for centuries, because there's no actual way to travel to them, and to do so in real space could take many millennia. In some respects, this could actually be positive for a planet. If they just existed outside of the Imperium and too difficult to reach even for other Xenos, you could actually end up in a quite idyllic situation. So while the warp enables humanity to travel the galaxy, it's not a means that's reliable by which you can just quickly or easily travel anywhere you wish. And this extreme difficulty and danger is why the devastating arrival of the Cicatrix Maledictum meant that many well-charted routes were just completely obliterated. And as a result, it became clear to any half-decent Imperial captains and senior officials that from its inception, any established points of travel across the rift bridging between those two regions in real space or the warp would become quickly raging war zones of unfathomable strategic importance, which is where we find ourselves at the Nachmund Gauntlet and Vigilus. In the period that led up to the Nachmund War, Vigilus was already acutely aware of the role it may have to play for the Imperium. Its proximity to the Eye of Terror had long put it on a war footing, which thankfully meant the planet was well equipped and fortified, but now the stakes had increased significantly. Vigilus had changed from being a strategically important support world to one of the most critical planets for the Imperium in the entire galaxy. The planets of the Vigilus system, a short distance from and to the galactic east of Cadia, found themselves on the wrong side of this abhorrent rift, but through a twist of the Tzeentchian strands of fate still remained accessible to the Imperium Sanctus. But for those stranded on the dark side of the galaxy, it was immediately apparent they had now entered a new darker phase of existence for humanity. Saying this though, worth remembering that the dark side of the galaxy, that is, Imperium Nihilus, was not literally dark. It didn't destroy the stars of systems, it simply inhibited warp travel by obscuring the Astronomicon. So on both sides of the Imperium, the Great Rift appeared often as a mere purple blur in the skies above their worlds during the day. By night though, it became far more insidious, more alive and dangerous, and some reported seeing faces and strange nightmarish visions drifting across it. When the rift split the Imperium in half, suddenly many thousands of worlds were faced with the mind-altering maw that was ever-present and unavoidable at all hours of the day. It robbed citizens of sleep, distorted their minds, it even went as far as to interfere with devices such as chronoslates and data webs. Due to its proximity to the rift, curfews were put in place for all citizens upon Vigilus as twilight fell and the strength of the Cicatrix Maledictum increased. This was no speculation or fear-mongering by authorities. The proximity of Vigilus to the rift meant that by night, a mere moment of attention risked individuals becoming contaminated by its malevolence and therefore rendered susceptible to psychic phenomena. This kind of infection by the warp is why often when humans have any kind of contact with the horrors of the Immaterium, they may well be purged, that is to say executed, by default. For those who understand the warp and the beings who exist within, they know all too well that it's very likely too dangerous for ordinary humans to live after witnessing the pure infinity of the void. Exceptions are made, of course, for those with specialized training, proven service records that demonstrate evident ability, and the mental strength to stand against the darkness. Micro-adjacent side note. I often hear people asking, do ordinary citizens know of chaos and the warp? How could they not, given the events that have occurred over the past 10,000 years of Imperial history? But the answer is more nuanced, because although worlds who directly face the enemies of chaos and some who serve within the Imperial Guard are more likely to have some baseline understanding or belief about the warp and chaos, there are significantly more worlds who really still know nothing of it at all, which is likely to their benefit in some regards, but that actually brings you back around to the Emperor's conundrum: what's better, ignorance or the primordial truth? So the answer really is it's variable. And it's worth remembering that some planets of the Imperium do not even believe that Xenos exist in the galaxy, so sheltered are they, and they only hear of such things as rumours, fishermen's tales that trickle down through the populace of a hive city from passing traders, passed from one person to another, around stories in bars and whatnot. So very often these kind of stories are just dismissed out of hand because such things sound surely completely nonsensical. So the Great Rift has already proven to have a disruptive and pervasive impact on human populations. Within the claustrophobic hab levels of hive worlds, strange graffiti and artworks are found scrawled upon walls. Their forms mirror the shapes and faces seen in the rift. Those who, especially in the beginning, ignorantly stared up at the rift for too long, found it as if a bright light had shone into their eyes, and now they could see its image permanently as if it were burned in motes of light to their vision, seemingly scarring their retinas permanently so that even closing their eyes tightly shut could not allow them to escape its form. Parents also began to discover to their horror that rift-shaped birthmarks were appearing on infants of hive cities close to the rift, something they of course made great efforts to conceal from authorities. Within the darkened corridors of hive cities, it even spread its form through natural organic growths, water stains on the walls, and the ceilings of water purification plants which mirrored the dark scar above. Purge squads of the ecclesiarchy made it their mission to exterminate all visible signs of such phenomena. But these heretical contaminations became even more prevalent and severe as time wore on, to a point that on Vigilus, when earthquakes were occurring and land opened up, upon investigation the landforms mirrored the swirling scarred forms of the Great Rift. With such detail it even represented thin land bridges which directly corresponded to the position of things such as the Nachmund Gauntlet. Now these troubling occurrences could be easily dismissed as being superficial simply due to the proximity of the planet to the rift itself. It is worth to recall that for many worlds, tolerance of even the smallest presence of chaos contamination can be devastating. Although the Imperium tells bold and impressive tales of repelling traitor assaults, it's more common that when a world begins to fall to chaos, it is rarely subjected to huge planetary assaults. More often, when a planet is corrupted by chaos, it will occur via cults, who have made it their primary goal to remain out of sight, but not entirely out of mind. Discovery of these cult cells can be very difficult, and it's only when initial signs that something is more broadly wrong could an investigation then be launched. And this could be very vague things like an increased general sleeplessness or shortened tempers in a population, persistent headaches, continual errors in fabrication and industrial centres, even just simple tasks. Such symptoms, though widespread, may continue to appear harmless and without a direct cause, but over time these may suddenly become more acute and then start to cause violent outbreaks, persistent sleeplessness causing citizens to even lose their minds. And very quickly, a world can then begin to unravel and enter an unexpected downward spiral that is difficult to claw back and return from. Because as symptoms begin to worsen and increase exponentially in a populace, this is finally when fanatical cult forces may choose to break out into the open in an attempt to then seize power upon a world now significantly weakened. This is of course comparable to the strategies of the Tyrannid cults, the Genestealer cults. Both operate by weakening a world internally before attempting to break the final pillars that are sagging now under the immense weight of societal collapse and are by now barely able to support a planet or hive city's stable operations. This is of course why the Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, Ministorum, the Sororitas continue to exist, because they will daily scour hive worlds seeking to purge any who show even the smallest signs of unusual behaviour, not to mention just general zealotry, purging squads who are little more than rabid religious worshippers in an orgy of violence, execution and immolating those who descend into the dark corners of a hive to escape the light of the Imperials. These individuals could be outright killed on the slightest pretext. Still, for as disorganised as these expeditions could be, they can actually be quite productive for the inquisitorial agents or ecclesiarchy operatives who are monitoring such activities. One of the most notable signs being, do they return or not? That can be quite indicative of a larger problem. For the world of Vigilus, its importance and stability had become vital, and it obviously did not take long for Roboute Guillermin himself to designate Vigilus as being invaluable. The fight for the Nachmund Gauntlet and Vigilus as a beachhead or staging position for Imperials attempting to maintain stability within the Dark Imperium began almost immediately. Thankfully, as noted before, it was already a strong Imperial world boasting both impressive industrial and defensive capabilities. It had a heavy presence of Imperial Guard upon the world, the Vigilant Guard and Tempestus, and this had now only been bolstered by the exodus of survivors from Cadia itself. And in what is a good example of how the Imperium does not really have a standardized template for leadership over planets, Vigilus was maintained by a loose confederation of both elected leaders and nobles called the Aquilarian Council, or to the Mechanicus, the Council of Cogs, which is surely a far more pleasing title. Comically though, the fact that delegates had found it extremely difficult to even agree on a name for themselves illustrates how ineffective and disruptive a leadership they were. Only their impending annihilation at the hands of many enemies of humanity focused their minds on the task at hand and allowed them to put petty differences aside for the time being. This was good timing because when a teeming wah of orcs burst from the Great Rift, the system's defenders responded with impressive response times and levels of force. Vigilus seems secure, at least on paper. As a planet, Vigilus was as inhospitable as many an Imperial hive world. Its desert wastelands that stretched out as wide as oceans between each city hive sprawl were not merely bleak and barren, but also actively dangerous. In places, the chemical composition of the dust dunes was so saline that it would burn exposed skin and could in fact desiccate bare flesh in a matter of hours. Not a problem with the right protective clothing, it would be true, but as you can imagine, dust storms could cause this material to be whipped into every chink of a traveller's gear and carried inside. Not to mention, of course, the shell-armoured predators that prowled the dunes and preyed upon the unwary. So it was a very dangerous environment. Hive sprawls are the main city formation upon Vigilus, and actually much like Atoma Prime's hive city of Tertium, these are a format of hive city that expand outwardly as much as vertically. So consequently they can span much larger areas than you typically see in a hive city, as large as a continent, and contain many tens of billions of Imperial citizens. Vigilus had long been a way station for Vigilus had also been something of a way station for forces that included Space Wolves and the Skitarii legions. Its industrial exports were also vital for the general Imperial war machine, so much so that within Segmentum Obscurus it had been designated as a planet focused entirely on production of war material and manpower, its specialty being defensive technology, which obviously with the current situation was no bad thing. Had it been a paradise world, things may have gone south far more swiftly. Even more auspiciously, the Mechanicus upon Vigilus had been blessed with the STC for Psi-Tech force fields. Holy Mars had even authorized their production. So the force fields that had been installed around the perimeter of every continent upon Vigilus, and these generally were enough to easily protect the world from wandering Xenos. The only price asked by the Mechanicus of Vigilus to compensate them was to be left alone upon the forged continent of Mega Borealis. Not really a continent, more a sprawling industrial cityscape, not dissimilar to the others that already covered Vigilus. But this in time proved to be a poor exchange, because the Mechanicus mining operations badly damaged the planet's subterranean water reserves to the point that available water started to become extremely scarce, and the Mechanicus paid little care to such matters, however, and continued digging deeper. So because of the severely diminished water availability even prior to the problems caused by the Mechanicus, agriculture upon Vigilus was extremely minimal. In fact, the planet's food production came from obscure sources such as vermin abattoirs and subterranean nutrivats, and these unpleasantly recycled fat-rich runoffs and nutrient-rich sweats were collected as they dripped from the grates of the planet's overpopulated manufactorum habs. There are of course other sources which we'll get into later. But water and its source became a powerful status symbol upon Vigilus, directly indicative of wealth and position. To nobody's surprise, the working population would drink water that was often dirty, foul-tasting, yellowish, but affordable and not completely toxic. The upper classes of citizen drank crystal clear aqua glacius, mined from the polar continent of Calyx Bane. The faithful of the Ministorum in Hyperia Hivespool drank recycled water purified with holy oils, aqua sanctus. The Adeptus Mechanicus drank the aqua meteoris, that they mined from frozen asteroids. So it was a complex situation in many ways for a pretty basic but essential planetary resource. Over the decades and indeed centuries, Vigilus had become a steadily more complex political situation, to the point that it now hosted several distinct power bases, all determined to pursue their own agendas no matter the cost. There was the Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy, which included the Sororitas and their own guard force, the more standard forces of the Imperial Guard as well, and then many of their number were also aligned with the Ministorum forces that had proven successful in steadily permeating through into regiments. But overall this caused tension among the factions, there was significant squabbling over important issues and resources, and then of course there was the standard aristocracy and nobles which threw all their requests into the mix. All of this though did dissipate when the disaster of the Rift bore down upon the world and its greater significance became apparent, or at least for a short period of time. When the skies split around Vigilus, many feared the planet would be consumed forever. But instead, it held the Cicatrix Maledictum at bay. Was it faith, the Emperor's will, a fluke of quantum entanglement or some other phenomena that kept this rift passage open? None could point to any concrete conclusions, but it was immediately targeted by covetous eyes, who set in motion their diabolical plans to secure it for themselves. Drakari raids struck from the webway. Eldari sent emissaries to warn of a greater enemy yet to come. And upon Vigilus, strict new laws were imposed making it forbidden to look at the night sky, curfew imposed to ensure all citizens remain indoors by night or face a flogging. As is so often the case, the heavy-handed but albeit necessary imposition of these new rules caused many within the population to seek out cults and groups who opposed such restrictions or were curious about the arrival of this strange new celestial phenomenon. The warp rift of the Cicatrix Maledictum scarred the sky above Vigilus, and as I noted earlier, the first enemy that the citizens of Vigilus found themselves battling were not to be outside forces of the Xenos or Heretic. Like many planets consumed by the malevolent ethereal forces that transition across the immaterial to the material plane, the people of Vigilus found themselves suffering continually upsetting and inescapable nightmares. They suffered sleep deprivation, shortened tempers that saw workers escalate everyday disagreements into physical confrontations evermore, every day. And these disagreements could eventually be qualified as turning into broader skirmishes, brutal random beatings in alleyways, embittered, disillusioned industrial workers refusing then to work and vocally protesting against the increasingly strict lockdowns that were being imposed upon them. Such disobedience even began to present itself in the form of more planned, structured uprisings, even astonishingly provocative acts of assassination in the upper spires. Vigilus as a planet had become so precarious overnight that it looked set to fall without a single traitor even having set foot upon the world. Vigilus was a massive world, and over the millennia upon it had been established multiple artificial continent-scale cities known as hive sprawls. Now these sprawls will contain upward growth much like a hive city, but they also expand outward horizontally. They're generally much larger than a typical, more vertically styled hive city and could contain many times more the average population. So instead of 1 to 10 billion, a sprawl could see anything like 10 to 30 billion citizens. Although obviously this can vary greatly depending on who controls such a city, its layout, design and overall purpose. The worlds which contain these continent-sized hive sprawls are the first steps to seeing a world become an ecumenopolis such as you see on Terra itself. These are worlds where the cities have grown so vast and linked together that they now effectively cover the entire surface of a planet. And this actually had begun to be discussed as an option for Vigilus. They were looking to their future, they were thinking about potential cities linking at some point. But on Vigilus, two of the biggest and most notable hive sprawls were known as Hyperia and Mega Borealis. Hyperia being the capital with its Ministorum and Governor's palaces, the Ecclesiarchy upon Vigilus had become a dominating power and had in effect its own city-state within Hyperia, including its own military force with the inclusion of Sororitas, the Vigilant Guard, and the Tempestus. Mega Borealis was the continent ceded to the Mechanicus in the ancient history of Vigilus, who then proceeded to basically strip mine the territory they controlled, including boring immense cavities out of the crust of the planet itself to create so-called boar hives. These are effectively Hive City icebergs. They still are impressive from above, but 10 times as much below the surface, and it was in the deepest depths of the Mega Borealis where they discovered and began to mine the veins of blackstone, that material which the Imperium has quite quickly discovered to be extremely critical for potentially future control of the galaxy. Unfortunately, others, including the Necron and now Chaos, are also well aware of this material, the Necron of course being aware of it for millennia, millions of years. In the darkest zones that were off limits to all but the most trusted members of the Mechanicus, servitors whose minds are continually wiped operate in near pitch conditions, harvesting this precious blackstone. The mineral is then stockpiled at the same level and heavily guarded. Its value is beyond estimation in the realm of generally traded materials of the Imperium. And we interestingly also do have information on the drills used by the Mechanicus to create these vast borehole mining operations that would later be backfilled as hive cities. The drill engines were several miles in diameter and so huge they had to be transported to Vigilus. The seismic activity of them on the surface was so significant that volcanic eruptions and earthquakes became commonplace. And once the spires were built up from the boar hives, they were so tall that some of the uppermost levels even pierced the atmosphere, meshing with space docks where ore barges and manufactorum ships were moored. The Mechanicus are long known also for their clever usage of a planet's own energy to power their cities. There have been many examples of them using the very liquid rock, the geothermal elements, even building their structures in or around these extremely hazardous conditions using force fields to withstand the immense heat and pressures. They equally use such raw power to then fuel their factorum and research facilities. And such was the case with the Storval on Vigilus. Deliberately, this was an area constructed over fault lines of the planet's crust, its volcanic generators harnessing the energy created by the continent's continual eruptions. And the technology to do so is believed to have been based on an STC pattern. This created a pleasing feedback and limitation of net energy loss during their drilling operations within the Mega Borealis, because each seismic event that they triggered actually fueled their power harvesting operations at Storval. At this location, once its immense capacitors and generatorum were satisfied, any excess power produced was then routed to Mega Borealis first, and if its needs had already been met, this could then be shunted on to other hive cities in order of priority, i.e. who could bid the highest for extra power, which the other hive cities almost always needed, and unsurprisingly it was generally sucked up by the aristocracy, sometimes industrial concerns. And another masterwork of the Mechanicus on Vigilus was the so-called Omnissian hoist. Essentially, this was the means by which they were transporting materials from the surface up into orbit through Mega Borealis via these immense spires. Apparently this was made possible by a complex system of microfiber carbon chains and duroplast capillaries. Partially telescopic and modular, these were created on an industrial scale by the workshops of the Mega Borealis primary hive, hauled into the stratosphere by a succession of low-orbit tugs. Mortwald was the city where consumables, primarily foodstuffs, were produced. They were able to grow what were designated as hyperflora, an extremely hardy form of cacti and other succulents, and these were clearly not ordinary cacti as we understand them to be though. They were said to be large enough to create entire forests and which contributed an oxygenating effect to the planet, for a period of time at least, but this was eventually overridden by the massive amounts of pollution. So suffice to say, whatever variation of bizarre cacti exist here on Vigilus, it's nothing that we would recognise or be familiar with, both in their ability to provide food production and oxygenation, nor to grow to such a scale that they could be described as forests. Because of its noble aristocracy and leadership, the most wealthy and powerful here lived in massive biodomes, which were essentially self-contained paradise worlds, completely alien to the heavy pollution, toxic wastes which existed outside. They had beautiful lakes, waterfalls, sculptures which punctuated lush, verdant gardens and viridian forests. Everything that one would associate with outstanding natural beauty was here, in stark contrast to the outside of the domes. So when war came to Vigilus, to no surprise, the domes suddenly became heavily reinforced with massive firepower surrounding them, including outside of Mortwald, which had built up its bastions and trench lines. The almost entire eastern border of the hive sprawl became a defensive line. Most interestingly and bizarre is a specific detail about Mortwald, that within the southern region of the Hivespore were their so-called vitae docks. Here the rich and powerful could engage with extremely unusual, powerful rejuvenation techniques, some merely stripping years off an individual, not just cosmetically but quite literally rejuvenating them. But we know that in the past, for example, the Imperium had discovered that some alien species could be crushed and rendered down into a potion that extended mortal life. But this had been something that was outlawed, and it was already exploited so viciously that that race was now believed to be extinct. But here on Mortwald, they had processes to achieve much the same result, some of which were really quite extreme, and bordered something more likely to be seen put into practice by Drukhari. For it is said that within the biosantic flesh plants, they were capable of detaching the heads of the rich and wealthy to then transfer them and suture them upon collected younger bodies. Such outlandish and extremely complex procedures were apparently not beyond the biomagi of Mortwald, although just where they acquired these new bodies for the privilege to be transferred onto is perhaps best left to the imagination. But it should be noted that individuals simply going missing within a hive city is a daily occurrence. This is though a great singular example of how ordinary humans look to extend their lifespan in a galaxy which is very often measured in many centuries if not millennia, far outside an ordinary human lifespan, especially in the conditions of M41. Now we said earlier that the source of water for untold billions upon Vigilus was of critical importance, and this is where Otek Hivespore comes into play, for it contained 5 vast reservoirs, which to no surprise became a desirable asset for all concerned during the first phase of the Vigilus war struggle. The reservoirs were in fact so vast that they more resembled landlocked seas. They gathered water from deep under the planet's crust via an elaborate system of pumps, capillary banks and pipeways, and were contributed to from specifically designed precipitation sites. For most of the water needed by the hive cities was pumped through pipelines, which also contained pipes to return polluted water, industrial runoff and reclaimed biomass, which was able to then be recycled and processed into potable fluids. And this is a good example of an Imperial world which is actually moderately self-sustaining, which can be somewhat uncommon with many Imperial hive worlds, requiring off-world supply for key resources, even for the absolute basics like water and food. Many hive cities in their planets are so barren and contaminated that self-production is now near to impossible, but most hive worlds will at least have entire districts dedicated to recycling and reducing the wastage of such critical necessities. They also will generally produce something of value which can be traded off within the general structure of the Imperium and the Administratum. Of course, any water sent between hive cities was mainly for the lower populace, because water, and specifically the type of water drank on Vigilus, was, as we said, a key indicator of wealth and status. So any of the far purer water produced from Otek was transported via land train convoy under heavily armed guard, and by that we mean militarum hellhounds. So the value of the cargo was considered very seriously. Hivespore Otek also held value in its data hives, which were said to still retain data from pre-imperial settlement. The Mechanicus greatly, of course, desired access to this because they believed them to likely contain dense, priceless troves of data. And the governors of Otek Hivespore understood this all too well. These data stacks, these data hives, were obviously used for bargaining among the council on Vigilus. Even when some access was granted, the Mechanicus priests were never allowed to access these archives unaccompanied. But it's also suspected that the tech priests possibly discovered a way to remotely access the data without permission. Knowing the Mechanicus, that sounds extremely likely. Continuing on with the water theme, Calyx Bane was one of the last areas of naturally occurring water on Vigilus. It was a source for the highest grade of pure water on the world, known as Aqua Glacius, and huge las cutter engines would slice off huge slabs of ice from these glacier fronts, and the giant monoliths of ice were then transported to the aristocracy of Mortwald, Hyperia, any areas that could afford them. In the process though of extraction, the Mechanicus also gained access deep below this glacial ice to valuable minerals and ore. The nature of the terrain and its deep crevasses that appeared over time were likely a result of the shifting ice sheets, creating a very high-risk environment, not to mention the logistical challenges of the temperature conditions, and the apex predators which prowled the region were as stealthy as they were violent. Hauler-sized ice mantis were seen frequently dragging ice workers away to be devoured in their lairs, and the near-invisible white worm was a horror that sought out any source of heat, usually humanoid, and burrowed through into their flesh for any too slow or preoccupied to evade them. More troubling, though, was the disappearances of workers, especially during blizzard conditions. Though no official Imperial sources existed to define their nature, rumours abounded, and the fact that so many glacial miners went missing was enough to cause grave productivity concerns in the upper echelons of the mining clades. But I'll cut to the chase for you. It was the Drukhari. Dontoria Hivespool, largest of all the inhabited areas of Vigilus, was an immensely overpopulated hive city. It had passed the Administratum recommended levels of population density millennia previous, and so consequently, when war erupted, the conditions of the populace and their reactions were predictably panicked and chaotic. The claustrophobic, narrow nature of the structures within Dontoria steadily condensed over centuries, meaning that combat within the city was extremely difficult. It did not require you to go many levels below the upper structures before you were immersed into darkness. Power failures were very common, and its hab areas are steeped in pollution, their outer walls often blackened, flaking, many interiors marked by sickly yellow staining just from the extremely low air quality and other chemical pollutants which filtered down through the structures. Hacking coughs, expectorant splutters were common within the city, and the lands of Macia's Delta, Smogfield and the Great Choke were swathed in a dense blanket of vile pollution that damaged the lungs of those without respirators. Its only local water source was polluted to the point that no life could exist within it, and it sickened any who dared to drink from it. But it didn't stop, of course, floating shanty towns being built right upon it. The Drukhari also are known to have raided the Hivespool more than once, taking a rich haul of captives away to meet their unspeakable, extended lives of pain and suffering. Similarly, the labyrinthine lower levels of the sprawl are very easy to remain concealed for the darker and the more insidious enemies of humanity, letting their contaminations seep out from the darkest corners of the hive. But of course it wasn't the darkest place on Vigilus. That would be reserved for Dirkden. For this was the most squalid and neglected sprawl of Vigilus. It was the small, effectively shanty town that formed a very ramshackle, rudimentary city sprawl. It had become home for those who had nowhere else to live. The Council of Vigilus had completely disregarded it as a legitimate city sprawl. But Dirkden's most notable structure was its half-finished skeleton of a hive city that, although teeming with life, was not sealed and self-contained like hive cities are usually. This is because its construction was never finished. But what happened, or why those who designed it disappeared, is not recorded by Imperial history. But it appears, for whatever reason, they began to instead build downwards into the naturally occurring subterranean networks beneath. But one structure that would become critical during the problems of Vigilus were its massive fort walls. Now, many of these huge fort walls had been established and linked the hive sprawls. Despite its low status, Dirkden was no exception, and so this structure takes the form of a double row of crenellated defences that ran to the distant horizon. It featured a rockcrete macro highway running between the hive sprawls, and these links between them meant that they were able to facilitate trade and transit. And these obviously were very resource hungry to construct both in materials and labour, but it was deemed necessary to mitigate continual losses in export convoys at the time. But in one fairly rare, socially constructive move, it had been hoped by the Council of Vigilus that by allowing the faithful of Hyperia to flood along the highway to Dirkden, it could improve both their discipline and social order, as well as the population's productivity. The theory was that eventually there could come a day when they might then be able to merge and construct those two cities into a single hive sprawl that would empower Hyperia all the more. But alas, this optimistic plan did not play out, and Dirkden proved only to be a depressing continual drain on resources. Of course, if there is one inevitably sustaining truth to life in the galaxy of M41, it's that things can always and often will get far worse before they get better. And so it would be for Vigilus, with the arrival of not one but two Xenos assaults. Given the state of internal planetary political tensions, power struggles, even covert sabotage upon one another, when the true enemies of humanity appeared, the result was a predictably disorganised, poorly coordinated defensive response. Orc spacecraft broke from the rift and poured into the Vigilus system. The disruption of the rift prevented any early warnings from Psykers, and the sheer volume and surprise of the emerging fleet smashed through the outer system defences, with the greenskin ships slamming with no apparent pattern, as is typical with orcs, into the wastelands between the hive sprawls of Vigilus. Such landings always take massive casualties, but this is no matter really for orcs, as the survivors are protected from immediate Imperial assaults by dome-like force fields, the wreckage easily converted swiftly into makeshift scrap towns that soon became the launch pads for the orcs to assault the hive sprawl cities. However, due to the powerful defense systems and defensive lines of the hive sprawls on Vigilus, the orcs learned this was for the time being not particularly effective, and so they resorted to attacking the land convoys and armoured patrols that travelled the wastes and desert between hive cities. Things seemed surprisingly stable, despite the world having been assaulted by this old enemy of humanity. But because of the increasing warp disturbances, the psi fields used by the Imperials suddenly began to fail, and with the orcs constantly daring each other to see who had the nerve to test the Umi's defense, it was noticed very quickly by the orcs that some of the shields were down. They attacked in typically orky fashion by throwing literally everything they had at the hive cities, and this was, unfortunately, a colossal battle force. The Mechanicus, Militarum and Sororitas were fighting all too suddenly for the very survival of Vigilus, and the Xenos were upon them. Every single bunker, street and trench line had to be paid for in blood and the imperial currency of human lives. So the situation was looking quite quickly pretty bad, but apparently not bad enough, for this is where a cult of the most abhorrent Xenos would erupt, seizing upon the circumstance of massive disruption and using it to their advantage. The Genestealer cult, known as the Pauper Princes, who originated from the world of Chancer's Vale. This was a slum imperial world infested with Genestealer cultists, some of whom had apparently at a time prior managed to reach Vigilus, and had steadily reached out with insidious tendrils into the population, growing their brood cycle after cycle. Heading the cult was its patriarch grandsire Worm, and they now saw the ideal opportunity to break out into the open. As I noted earlier, Tyranid and Chaos infestations operate fairly similarly by initially reaching out into a population very carefully, tentatively, not creating too many ripples in the water, securing trusted members who know how to stay out of the sights and records of officials, growing their numbers cautiously over many years, and only when they see a sign of weakness, a rare opportunity to seize power, do they take the chance of assaulting in plain sight and begin targeting key positions and infrastructure as part of a broader plan to take control of a world. Not to mention, of course, both will very often infiltrate and install people who are sympathetic to their cause in positions of power within a hive world. In the case of Vigilus, however, there was another reason than opportunity for the Genestealer cultists to break out into open combat. Any cult that embeds itself upon an imperial planet is setting itself up to play a very long game, a patient game of waiting. So when suddenly a gigantic horde of orcs begins barreling straight into a hive city upon a world that a cult may have spent decades carefully inserting itself into positions that it will hope to usurp and seize power and control over, all of that careful subterfuge is for naught if a bunch of stomping, romping orcs starts smashing it all to pieces and burning down their best laid plans overnight. So it would be very much in a cult's interests to take that opportunity to seize control of imperial assets and simultaneously deal with the Green Menace deluging their hive spores before all of their efforts are basically made redundant. They had remained masterfully undetected within the hive sprawl of Dirkden, a neglected city compared to others upon Vigilus. Its lack of resources and development had left it ripe as well for abuse by the cult, who were heavily embedded here, and largely outnumbered loyalists. They'd even gained access to the Mechanicus data scripts and consequently shut down the city's bastion force fields. The orcs responded and ploughed toward the wide open sprawl of Dirkden. Cult agents had carefully conspired to place guard forces on the outer perimeter's defensive lines, with reassurances that this was only a temporary measure while the bastion's shielding was being brought back online. This did not take place. Instead, the cultists seized and overpowered whatever military forces remained within the city hive walls and raised the shields, leaving the loyalist guards facing down an orc horde outnumbering them at least 3-1. A brutal slaughter ensued, and as panic-stricken citizens fled the city, which was now very clearly collapsing to non-imperial control, cultists embedded themselves within this tide of uncorrupted, panic-stricken refugees who fled across the immense fort wall connecting Dirkden to the Hyperia hive sprawl. The journey would take them many days. The cultists also struck Otek hive sprawl to the west of Hyperia, and here their operation was met with a far stronger resistance, but they were able to take control of enough resources in the city that they contaminated the drinking water of billions with their insidious genetic taint. As was perhaps to have been expected, the less than efficient Aquilarian Council of Vigilus had initially felt confident in their defences, with fair reason. But now with disorder and collapse occurring all across the world, not to mention reports of 2 major hive sprawls facing disruption from within, things seemed to be quickly spiralling. Broken and garbled messages were detailing subterranean uprisings that were at first attributed to disruptive rebels, criminal elements and opportunists, things that the council barely paid attention to initially, because such matters were the jurisdiction of the local arbites or stationed militarum, already withstanding orders to crush any signs of rebellion or insurrection. The council focused on the broader political strokes of the situation, industrial war output and so on. But these other reports continued to build, violent uprisings, incidents where official forces were destroyed or simply not heard from again. The picture was building of something more significant and far more troubling occurring. But the council was still not focused enough on the details that lay within these reports. They certainly were not well versed enough in Xenos to understand the strange, curled, spiny icon that was now being visibly displayed upon walls, banners and arches of Imperial architecture, nor were they conscientious enough to study very carefully the specifically worded reports and details that mentioned sightings of 4-armed mutants. They had more important matters to focus on: industrial output, maintaining critical resources, and of course shoring up their own interests within the hive cities that they themselves resided in. The Ministorum Council members, for example, were to ensure that the Sororitas and ever-faithful Vigilant Guard stayed close to their power centre of Saints Haven in Hyperia, despite the fact that they had in their hands reports which demonstrated the nearest Xenos threat were hundreds of miles away, breaking upon the walls of other hive sprawls. This kind of self-serving ignorance is quite typical for Imperial worlds, and it's another example of the many problems facing the Imperium. Noble politicians who gain their seats of power by hereditary systems, riches or control of critical planetary resources, but who actually have little if any experience dealing with anything other than the day-to-day human problems of quelling disquiet among the unwashed masses. So when suddenly an insidious alien threat appears upon a world, they trust in the forces that they always have to put down the problem in standard fashion, whilst expending minimal risk and cost to themselves and their peers. And it's why on so many worlds other than those which are strictly run by the more senior control of the Imperium are often in a very, very bad situation before any help arrives and can salvage what's left. So here on Vigilus, it was quite typical, because as is so often the case, the leadership were very inexperienced, were thinking primarily about retaining forces to look after themselves rather than the broader strategic situation for the entire planet. Consequently, the concept of counterattacks when appropriate or other strategic values were just not requested, because the leadership prioritised their own safety and that of their guilds, families, far more than, say, the slum Dirkden hive sprawl, for which they likely cared little if it survived or fell one way or the other. It was entirely an expendable site. For the elites, their only thought was truly retaining the maximum amount of firepower for their own self-preservation. This, of course, was partially due to the divided and also largely self-serving nature of the council as it had existed prior to the current state of affairs, and whilst they were now at face value working in a spirit of cooperation and serious discussions about allying forces to defend should X, Y and Z situation take place, they certainly were not in good faith thinking about the bigger picture of Vigilus beyond their own walls of their hive cities, and certainly not within the wider picture of the Imperium and the Nachmund Gauntlet. Of course though, there were people who fully understood its significance, and they were certainly not the type of Imperial officials one would want to cross by having them see the absolute shambles of a defence that was currently unfolding on Vigilus. By now, multiple Astartes forces were en route to Vigilus, but it would take them roughly a year to actually arrive, and in that time the Sororitas and the planet's guard and militia forces were barely able to hold on, standing against the widespread disruption of orcs who continually battered the perimeters of the various hive sprawl. The first Space Marines to make planetfall on Vigilus were the Iron Hands and their successor chapter Brazen Claws. This was of course intimidating enough for the leadership of Vigilus, but there was another force sent by Guilliman himself, and they would arrive soon after this initial support force, whose primary goal was to drive back and just hold the line against the orcs. So when these initial Astartes forces translated into real space, they quickly saw only a few orc ships in the system between themselves and Vigilus. It didn't seem too serious of a situation. But this was due to the fact that the orcs had presumed that they were able to quickly control the planet and so had slammed their ships into its surface, but had then found that in actuality the humans' Bastion class force fields were quite difficult to breach, and their momentum was interrupted. Their battles had stalled, and it turned out to be no bad thing for the inept leaders of Vigilus. When the Astartes began to deploy to the surface of the world, however, they discovered quite quickly there was more going on here than they had been led to believe, and that the Imperials upon Vigilus had been fighting a more complex situation, although fighting is perhaps a pretty loose term, and the Imperials upon the world had been dealing with a much more complex situation. Sororitas patrols which strayed into areas of hive cities controlled by the Genestealer cults were regularly ambushed in very intense firefights. The Astartes discovered saturation levels of tank traps, barbed wire that was strewn with the grim, unmoved corpses of those who were unable to be saved and retrieved. Militarum armour had fared no better, and where the burned out remains of tanks and APCs were absent, in their place were sinkholes filled with armour, apparently having collapsed into subterranean corridors, presumably deliberately hollowed out as a means of blocking and trapping armoured columns. The hive sprawls that they had entered into were a disastrous mess. Vigilus' air support was also focusing on the movements of the green-skinned tribes primarily, confining them where necessary with punitive strafing runs. And while the Astartes were taking initial reads of the situation on the ground, the orcs were very obviously highly excited by the prospect of some new Eds to smash, and so were quickly headed directly for the armoured superhuman warriors. But where the incredibly obvious orc speed boys racing across the wastes towards newly deployed Astartes could be seen from many miles away, their huge dust clouds kicked up by their machines, this very obviously enabled the Vigilus Guard to perform the strafing runs on them with their Valkyrie before they even came near to the cities themselves. It also enabled the defenders plenty of time to prepare and plan their artillery strikes and other defensive positions. The cultists, though, were very different. They had embedded themselves within the cities and were much more problematic. It was becoming quickly apparent to the Astartes support force that the Vigilus command structure had effectively collapsed almost from the outset, overwhelmed by having to deal with two different Xenos threats which required two completely different strategies to deal with. Things had not been going any better within the continent-scale hive sprawl of the Mega Borealis and the Mechanicus. Once the orcs had breached the perimeter of the hive sprawl for reasons that can only be guessed at, the Lord of Hive Scalaris, Tech Priest Dominus Epluvius 14, froze up. In a very bizarre rarity for a member of the Mechanicus, it appears his mental feedback loop robbed Skitarian Mechanicus troops of any directions other than initiative-based squad-level commands, at the worst possible time. Now, was this due to the rift itself, or had he been affected in some other way, perhaps even some infiltration by Genestealer cultists? Either way, the situation became severe very quickly, and even the Imperial Knights and Titans were not contributing to the defence of the Mega Borealis. Worse still was that quickly the unfolding threats risked losing control of the Mega Borealis' boar hive of Scalaris, which was critical to the vast sea of Manufactorum, as it had been built atop of a thermal stack that yielded endless geothermic power and was the key to power in the sprawl. As with the other areas of the planet, the Genestealer cultists of Mega Borealis rose up, and then the defences really did collapse. All the designed defence plans and strategies were at this point effectively rendered obsolete. And in what they hoped would be a killing blow, the gene sect of the Writhing Worm, a sub-faction of the Pauper Princes, had captured one of the most terrifying of Imperial weapons, a Vortex missile. They carried it deep into the Hive City, that they accessed using torn-out biometrics of slain Authority figures to access the necessary checkpoints. The Vortex missile was detonated beneath the slumbering warlord Titan Dominus Rex. Its explosion was so potent that it sent off a string of detonations that destroyed not only the Rex, but also triggered a chain reaction that spread to all the Titans alongside it. So I think it would be fair to say that the cult had caused a truly catastrophic situation within the Mega Borealis. There was little to be salvaged, but one Archmagos, Kaldrike, took control of the situation, relieving Epluvius 14 of command, who was then placed in cryo storage. The Mechanicus were then able to consolidate what remained of their defensive forces, with the Iron Hands Astartes able to then mitigate further damage. Although to be fair, the damage inflicted upon the Hive Sprawl of the Mechanicus was already extremely severe. Meanwhile, within Dontoria Hive Sprawl, they would face one of the worst situations yet seen upon Vigilus. An old transport arrived to one of its landing ports. It had been refusing any requests for landing access codes and was obviously being fired upon as it came in, but it seemed to have been shielded from the fire being laid down upon it by security forces, and so when its hatches clunked open, the true horror of its payload was revealed. Stumbling out from the heavily worn, ruined transport came a crowd of distended, bloated mutants, the transmission tools of Nurgle, the Galapox infected. Their assault was easily put down, but unfortunately the same could not be said for what followed, a detachment of Death Guard. Their distended, leaking bodies and horned, misshapen armour, the sight of them alone was enough to make many retch on sight. They quickly, though, descended away from the firefight into the darkened lower levels of Dontoria. Contact was lost, and none were keen to pursue them. For the brave souls who did, however, they were never heard from again. Very soon after, a firebombing purge of the lower levels, covering a radius of several miles from their last known position, was apparently enough to consider the matter closed to the local Imperials and the Council, which seems wildly poor judgment. And so, inevitably, when a plague mysteriously began to spread through the populace, it was clear that the matter was indeed not concluded. Now, disease was something already greatly feared in Dontoria. Its claustrophobic environment of the city meant that previous pandemics had taken a very severe mental and physical toll on the already weak population. So when reports of a supernatural plague began to appear, a disease that melded flesh with metal to form hideous blends of man, machine and demonic anatomy, parodies of human form you might say, for the citizenry it was very much time to panic. Only the rogue trader Delarique de Languille, operating out of Litmus's highest spire on her quest to chart the Nachmund Gauntlet, recognised the disease for what it was, the Galapox. She was recorded as saying, quote, "The magnitude of this infection cannot be underestimated. This is no natural plague, no malady that the human body can fight and overcome. This is the Galapox. It is fully capable of causing flesh to run like wax, to swell and burst, even to blend with augmetics, war gear and those machineries close at hand whilst the sufferer sleeps. The resultant hybrids are as tough as Ogrins and singularly focused on bringing their blight to as many uninfected as they can find. In the name of the Astra Cartographica, I implore you, quarantine Dontoria effective immediately, or lose your planet to an enemy you cannot fight." Of course, her advice was roundly ignored, and the plague spread like wildfire, which created further problems as then the citizenry were taking matters into their own hands, burning the infected wherever they were found. Bands of mutants and nightmarish hulking terrors stalked the streets, controlling their own territory. Elsewhere, the streets thronged with giant vermin that sometimes appeared to be more like living dead creatures, their forms twisted beyond biological limits. Street gutters were thick with fat, horrible, translucent sludge grubs. Eye stinger swarms flitted through the skies in search of fresh prey to smother and sting into a swollen, blind, blistering mess of oozing pus. Nurgle had granted his blessings upon Dontoria, and only rogue trader Languille seemed to fully appreciate what they were facing. She again requested extensive quarantine measures of the Aquilarian Council, but privately she feared it was already too late. The first Space Marines who had arrived upon Vigilus were small but potent strike forces, who engaged in battle within seconds of planetfall. The Brazen Claws mercilessly set about slaughtering orcs as if it were just another day. The Iron Hands entered the Mega Borealis of the Adeptus Mechanicus to help slow the collapse there, and then the Space Wolves were also present. They had concentrated their attacks upon O-Tech Hive Sprawl, for they had received word of a Xenos infestation there that would test their hunting skills. What had become quickly clear for the Astartes was that any communications with the Planetary Council proved frustrating and counterintuitive. The leaders of the planet seemed both ignorant and arrogant in the extreme, and with their limited numbers, none of the Space Marines sent representatives to address that situation. Spending hours in debate with bureaucrats was not useful nor appealing, so they simply relied upon communicating with chapter brothers via their own comm systems. It was enough to keep them apprised of the broad tactical situation. What had been largely unseen by the Council upon Vigilus was that the worlds of the system itself appeared to be suffering attacks by the forces of chaos, and so librarians of the Astartes strike forces had sent psychic missives to their chapter masters hoping for more reinforcement. In the dead of night, Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines was visited by a vision of Chief Librarian Tigurius. He understood that of course this was no mere vision, but Tigurius reaching out to him in his astral form with a message of great importance, the Primarch himself had ordered that Vigilus could not be allowed to fall. Calgar quickly secured a powerful force of every Astartes asset he could requisition, chapter masters and navigators were briefed, and began the journey to the Vigilus system. Surrounded by his finest librarian disciples in the depths of the fortress of Hera, the chief librarian of the Ultramarines, Tigurius, guided the fleet through the madness of Imperium Nihilis. It cost several epistolaries who died clawing at their own eyes, but without their efforts many ships would have been lost and their arrival badly delayed. The Ultramarines Armada had not reached Vigilus without its own losses. Several ships had been lost en route, including all aboard. They set out under their sub-warp engines now for Vigilus. Any remnants of the Orc flotilla who existed in the vicinity were calmly obliterated. Calgar issued orders to the Astartes already on the surface not to inform the local authorities of his approach and arrival. He did not wish to become embroiled in protocol and politicking. The Astartes force was not there to follow diplomatic procedures, they had come to restore order to Vigilus. Tight formations of drop pods smashed down to the surface, and Astartes quickly meshed their efforts with the beleaguered local forces, near instantaneously restoring their hope, morale, and determination with their presence alone. The arrival of an Astartes to any planet that is under Xenos assault brings a huge benefit for the fighters of that world, who, as we have seen, regularly have to contend with ignorant, egomaniacal politicians. In stark contrast to the Space Marines who upon arrival within the first few minutes will be issuing direct orders, requisitioning ordnance for fire missions and reinforcing defensive positions for guardsmen. It makes a huge difference to the effectiveness and willing sacrifices to be made by ordinary humans, such as are often exhausted in every respect, having fought a trudging uphill war on multiple fronts. Unfortunately for the Aquilarian Council, this meant that where the Iron Hands and Brazen Claws had not even bothered to send a representative to liaise with them, as they had quickly realised this to be both a waste of time and tedious, the same could not be said for Marneus Calgar. Ultramarines, whilst warriors of legend, they also follow the teachings of their Primarch and are generally speaking master diplomats and strategists. Calgar being one of the longest serving and most experienced examples in his former role as the chapter master and ultimate authority in Ultramar. What would he make of this despotic council of self-serving bureaucrats? Very obviously, not much. When Calgar flung open the doors to the lavish, almost obscenely adorned debating hall of the council, he could immediately see the all too typical rot and corruption of human self-interest. In fact, astonishingly, as soon as the initial diplomatic niceties were dealt with, the council actually slid back into argument, sniping and finger-pointing among themselves, almost disregarding Calgar's presence entirely. Sure enough, as an enraged Calgar ordered many of the council immediately removed, as they were being dragged out of their seats, the truth was laid plain. Several of the council were exposed to have purplish, knobbled skin under their luxurious garments, concealed by skin hue grease paint, but undeniably alien. With the truth revealed, cultists rushed forth with knives drawn, an inevitable scene played out. The concussive force of bolters echoed to a deafening roar within the chamber, so much so that glass shattered, many council members dove under tables, cultists were executed, council members bound, lashed and exiled. Calgar had no faith nor patience for the remaining bureaucrats to be useful given the gravity of the situation. He assumed command of Vigilus. although carefully vetted advisors remained from the former Aquilarian Council who were clearly disciplined, loyal, and understood the planet and its hive sprawls. Thus, the Vigilus Senate was formed. One of its first actions was to reorder its command structure, not a small matter, but with the infestations that clearly had taken hold, it was extremely necessary. For Calgar, the first step to victory was accurate knowledge of just what was happening where, and far clearer communication. The newly approved members of the Vigilus Senate found it far easier to speak with someone as objective and experienced as Lord Macragge, in stark contrast to their former masters who made a habit of continually shutting down key information, speaking over one another, and vicious, petty sniping. Ensuring the Senate and command structure of Vigilus remained intact was critical, and so Calgar installed a new security force of Ultramarines titled the Extremist Guard. They proved their worth almost immediately in shrugging off an Eldari attack that could have crippled the entire Vigilus command structure. It was revealed that in fact the Eldari of Craftworld Simhan had divined Vigilus as a world of paramount importance in their eternal battle against the great enemy. Thus they had sent some of the fiercest clan warriors to tip the scales of fate against the Chaos Uprising that was gathering pace on the planet. But what could have been potential allies resulted in a fierce battle, with the Eldar ultimately forced to flee. Calgar turned to the troubling situation of Dontoria. Until now, this had surprisingly been largely ignored, with the defenders generally focused on the far more visible orc assaults and cultist uprisings. Calgar saw things differently. Rogue trader Langrill was spoken of as having been one of the few voices who had warned of the need to address what was occurring within Dontoria. Calgar immediately summoned her to hear what she had to say. In considerable contrast to the former council's glacial decision-making process, it took barely minutes of her testimony for the newly appointed Lords of the Senate to reach and enact a decision. The chapter master of the Necropolis Hawks would lead the fight against the Galapox. The Crimson Fists would connect with the Iron Hands to establish an intensively strict cordon in an attempt to contain the plague. And as the Necropolis Hawks entered the area, which was ground zero for the outbreak of contagion, they soon discovered the situation was far from being low priority. Shambolic lumbering mutants with skulls and distended bodies melded with steel lurched from alleyways and choke points. Vermin leapt from windows to stab at armour joints with proboscis and forelimb, and lumbering flesh hulks belched bizarre flames from their mouths. At close confines, the powerful claws and improvised weapons of these monsters made them lethal opponents, but with bolt and plasma they were caught in an exterminating crossfire, and areas were steadily cleared and marked as such. The Crimson Fists drew the cordon tight, using Land Raider Redeemers and flame-spewing hellhounds of the god. Promethean pipelines were opened up, so that by now a quite literal firewall was established around the infected zone. The net had been cast, and now for Calgar and his Senate, the only choice left was to understand they were about to consign hundreds of thousands of civilians to a hideous death. But if it meant saving billions, such prices are deemed acceptable for the Imperium. As Promethean fires blazed around Dontoria, the Iron Hands enforcing the quarantine astonishingly allowed frustration and offence to impede their previous efficiency, which was now nothing more than sheer brutality. The populace, with such limited options, opted to brave fire and corruption rather than go face to face with merciless Astartes. Many fled. Iron Hands kill teams attempted to destroy the escapees, but then found themselves entangled and confronted with Death Guard among the darker and despairing depths of Dontoria. It was not a textbook example in controlling such a site of contamination, but it would be true to say that the previously dire situation had appeared to be brought largely under control. Rogue trader Langrill's role was still far from complete. She had been told by her psychers that before the firewall was completed, a freighter had left containing the plague that saw flesh blended with machine. The ship was headed for the warp, its destination, Terra. Her only hope was to leave immediately and attempt to intercept the freighter before it reached the system's Mandeville point, but only her unarmed corvette cruiser was fast enough to reach them. In an example of both the benefits and limitations of warp travel, within 60 hours Langrill had sighted a green-grey dot on their monitors. It was the freighter Illustrious Cargo. Taking a handful of her finest agents in a transition pod, they boarded the vessel. The nightmares that were found inside remain only in sealed documents seen by Calgar and rogue trader Langrill. But she alone would return to Vigilus and did not speak to it other than posting her action debrief with Calgar. What is known is that the Illustrious Cargo was destroyed before it could translate into the warp, the energy signature of the explosion indicating that its engine decks had been sabotaged from the inside. But it was then that they discovered an extremely disturbing communication from the same Dontorian dock, that several other vessels had departed a day earlier than the illustrious cargo, using the same idents and marked with the same destination. For all her efforts, the Gellerpox infection was slowly crossing the Nachmund Gauntlet towards the Stars of Terror. The only obvious conclusion was that they must be located and stopped at any cost. The Orcs, meanwhile, were being Orc-like, hence running wild all across the planet, and they were bloody loving it. High velocity, high violence, high warg. In the mech towns, teeth was changing faster than a thirsty knob with a big gob, or so you might say, but there was a lot of trading and upgrading going on to satisfy the mob's insatiable need for faster bikes and shootier guns. One thing you could say for the Orcs, they certainly had more presence of mind to them than the former council of Vigilus, and were on a day-to-day basis bashing anything they could as hard as they could. Meanwhile, the troubling absence of the definitely previously reported Death Guard, who had been largely ignored and disappeared into the depths of Dontoria Hivespawn, and just to note, if it were me, personally probably should have been looked into a little sooner, was becoming more concerning. One of the unmentioned other Hivespawns so far was of course Mortwald, out to the far west of Dontoria and on the east side of Mega Borealis. It was the producer of most of the planet's food and medicine, which, with the Orcs disrupting shipments and cultists also rising, had become critically problematic. Thankfully, Mortwald did not lack for experienced soldiery. It had been steadily reinforced over many years by regiments, including the likes of Lokar Prime Sandsmen, Vostroyans, and dispossessed Cadian shock troops. For such experienced soldiers, they would face down the Orc Menace hive shields or no. For once you've stood to defend the Cadian Gate, there's little else you wouldn't be willing to face after. In fact, in many ways, facing down a fairly traditional ground-pounding engagement against an enemy whose most vicious weapons are generally projectile weapons, melee implements, and things with a lot of teeth, it's actually quite preferable, for some perhaps even leisurely, compared to facing down the hellish enemies of Chaos and the Warp. So no matter what was thrown at the defenders of Mortwald, they held the line, and so by the time of Imperial reinforcements in the form of the mighty Astartes of the Imperial Fists, who came bounding out of their dropships in bright gold and yellow ceramite and immediately charged forth to reinforce the defensive lines, the guardsmen who had faced for many months the unrelenting rage of the Orcs, or the alien subterfuge of ambush and infiltration of cultists, were so emboldened by the arrival of the Emperor's Angels, they instantly became unafraid of any enemy, their souls burning with righteous zeal. For they knew with the unbreakable support of the Imperial Fists now at their side, it meant they would hold the line, and in their own minds had already won. Expectedly, not only did the Imperial Fists implement an extremely effective defensive plan, as well as reinforcing the already solidly primed defences of Mortwald, they also oversaw the deployment and arrival of many Imperial Knight houses, including wandering Freeblades. Mortwald had turned from being ignored by the previously ineffective Council to now looking like an unbreakable defensive bastion and one of the strongest hive spores on Vigilus. However, for the knights that had arrived from the nearby world of Daravar, their noble pilots continued insistence to lead an extremely aggressive vanguard assault when it were clear that for now simply reinforcing their defensive positions was all that was necessary, raised suspicion among the Imperial Fists, especially when coupled with the fact that many had seemingly obscured their traditional insignia. The senior princeps of the Reaver Titan, Horatium's Bane, also reminded them that he wished for nothing more than to unleash his warhound Maniple, the Hyperion hounds, out into the wastes to hunt down the Xenos filth, but even they had accepted the logical necessity to simply hold the line. Nothing was to be gained by stepping out from their defensive positions of Mortwald. However, the situation would change as the Orc forces steadily returned with larger and larger machines of war. When Titan-scale monstrosities appeared on the horizon, the call was made that Orc factories had to be destroyed. Within the hour, the Knights and Titans were striding across the wastelands, and when the Freeblade Knights assaulted the Orc scrap city Tanker Spill, smashed through a wasteland horde at full charge, expertly utilising their directional ion shields to deflect fire, the Knights destroyed them with such speed, force and ferocity that many surviving Orcs were completely disorientated, milling around in disarray, which meant they were easy prey for the support of the Warhounds. The Knights smashed through the factories of Tanker Spill. Most Orcs were out speeding around or crushed by the slaughter of their approach. But after the city was burning, the knights could not be compelled to return to Mortworld. They charged on for the next Orc city, seeking more slaughter, more blood, more killing. Mega Borealis had suffered, but thanks to the effective support of the Astartes and the Mechanicus-owned Skitarii, much of the city was now under Imperial control, and the situation seemed stable. The Xenos Genestealer cultists had been killed in good numbers, but in one area, their banners were still raised high, and the cultists knew their time was now short, so they deployed a plan that would see the Patriarch and Pure Strain Genestealers lead an assault to try and salvage something of the situation. Just as with many Hive cities, the lower levels were so complex and unmapped and unsupported by any infrastructure that few knew their layout or cared to venture down. Thus, with the Orc War above, the lower levels were quite easily the domain of the Genestealer cult and its Pure Strain Genestealers. Before they even knew what was happening, the Skitarii were engaged in a sprawling multi-level battle, but the Mechanicus were holding out well, their tech priests having established battle plans for every conceivable form of invasion, except apparently infiltration of their water systems, the pipelines being considered too narrow to be any kind of risk. Unfortunately for them, the Genestealer physiology enabled them to travel through extremely narrow, high-pressure pipelines to emerge at the highest levels of Hive spires, where the moisture farms were located. The slaughter above was brief, but now the Skitarii were truly surrounded, their enemies assaulted from above and below, and finally, after 3 days of fighting, it was all over. The Astartes had made significant progress, but cleansing the Xenos from the Hive sprawls was only the first stage. To truly win victory, they needed to scour the filth from the planet itself, and that meant a change of tactic. They needed a major offensive. The charge of knights into the midst of the Orcs had seemingly ended in ultimate failure, but it had been something of a start, something to capitalise upon. So Astartes strike units were quickly formed using gunships and bikes. The Orcs held impressively powerful artillery, but this could be evaded by the smaller, faster strike units of the Astartes, not to mention it became clear that some number of those Freeblade Knights were still somehow holding out among the Orc cities, but not for long, and the few who remained were literally being pulled to pieces. What the Astartes lacked in numbers, they did make up for with their speed and evasive abilities, with the much slower, clunky Orcs constricted trying to fight in and among their own scrap cities with their narrow, heavily congested alleyways and corridors. Their vehicles were designed for wasteland warfare, but the bikers of the White Scars and Raven Guard were adept in threading their mounts through the alleyways and rubble of ruined cities. The Orcs' scrap city was no different. And where the Orcs began to congregate and gather themselves together, too much for the Astartes to deal with, they could pull away to a distance and assault somewhere else, much to the frustration of the Orcs, who simply wanted a stand-up fight, not this constant running and hiding. But just picking away at the Orcs was not entirely the plan for the Astartes. They did need to finish this. So they intended to press on and attempt to destroy the factories at the heart of the Orc cities to destabilize and slow them down enough that perhaps they could be eradicated. But this necessity proved to be an unfortunate undoing, for as effective as they had been with their hit-and-run tactics, the Astartes found themselves outnumbered quickly in the more dense areas of the central city, so much so that first the Raven Wing and then White Scars were forced into retreat. The Orcs would live to fight another day, and there was much bawling and shouting from the Orcs about that very fact. And again, this is an interesting aspect about Orcs. As much as they always want to have a good fight and to finish it and win, to survive a battle once it's started is also beneficial for them. From the Astartes' point of view, this is never a good thing, because the Orcs tend to come away with some kind of impression of victory, which ultimately then makes them more invigorated to fight, and so it could mean that they will become stronger and generally more aggressive, not things you really want to see with Orcs. So for all the damage that had been done by the Astartes during their raid, it may well have overall been quite counterproductive. At this point, Vigilus was far from anything that one would want to term salvation. For every small victory, broader control seemed to slip further through the fingers of the Imperials, something that Calgar was apparently all too aware of when he was forced to embarrassingly pull forces out from the slum of the Dirk Den Hive Sprawl, which was now overwhelmed by Genestealer cultists who were more preoccupied with Orcs than those of the Imperium. On the plus side, it made determining its fate more straightforward, as they could now simply write it off. This still, though, was a depressing situation. Dirkden was of low value, to be sure, and its fate in many ways seemed predetermined in the event of such a planetary war. Worse still for any civilian refugees fleeing along the link fort wall that connected it to Hyperia in the north, for they were now no longer being allowed to traverse across and left seemingly to their own fates. Calgar had abandoned some tens of millions of civilians in Dirkden for little other reason than allowing the two Xenos forces to occupy themselves by fighting each other, which of course they did, and within days the sprawl of Dirkden was ablaze. Its miles and miles of smoke blackened the horizon seen from Hyperia. Even more appalling, but deemed sadly necessary, were that the fleeing civilians of Dirkden, who understandably had so few options that attempting to cross the wall seemed their best bet, were prevented by the unmovable force of the Crimson Fists, whose quite legitimate reasoning being that amidst the vast number of civilians were infiltrators of the Genestealer cults who wanted nothing more than to slide into Hyperia and begin a new brood, and they were correct in that assessment. But nonetheless, when rocks and other objects were beginning to be thrown by protesters, the Marines opened fire, playing out a scene that had been seen thousands of times before in the Imperium's history, reminiscent of the Emperor's brutal wars of suppression during the period of unification. The barely armed civilians were cut down by superhuman warriors in a horrifying scene of carnage, a true blemish upon the honour of the Crimson Fists to be sure. Calgar believed it was the right choice nonetheless. The severity of the decisions now being made though did little to instill a feeling of optimism in the general populace, in fact quite the contrary. But then things started to get weird. The rift appeared blackened at its edges, Vox ghosts were beginning to be heard, a spear of light was seen exiting the rift, but no readings could make anything of it. More oddities followed, along with sightings of winged figures around the hive spires. Abductions began to be reported, and critical areas were suddenly found abandoned. Specialist teams of guardsmen sent to report on such sightings were not seen again, but reports did begin to filter in of blackened bodies and mangled corpses littering the highest points of Imperial architecture. Marneus Calgar and the Vigilus Senate took a stern interest here. Not only did they suspect the worst, but these sightings were being reported from every hive sprawl on Vigilus. The ground war had been grinding on, and had become so all-encompassing that none had really bothered to pay attention to what was occurring in the heights of the hive spires, which are often, in many worlds, their own isolated environments, where only the wealthiest families and the industrialists could afford or earn the right to exist. And mostly, no news meant good news. So the Imperials had remained focused on the wider populations and the more frontline situations of the rampaging orcs and insidious cultists. They realised now that they had become willfully blind to what had come to Vigilus whilst they were preoccupied with the literal wars below. Meanwhile, above their heads, a plague of a different nightmare had descended upon the upper echelons of society as the rift diffused its saturated warp corruption. This had begun by superficially presenting itself as, again, is often seen, merely disrupted sleep, bad dreams. Some people were heard talking to themselves or rambling nonsense. It was only when one Inquisitor Frenza began to decipher it that she learned it was the dark tongue of chaos. At first it was indecipherable, but eventually the more corrupted individuals became, then did the syllables harden into more distinct words. But even more disturbing was that as study of such corrupted civilians progressed, it became all too clear they were not merely rambling, but chanting, and in unison. When translated, they appeared to be calling out, "The Dark King is coming." The investigations, when finally given more weight, began to reveal a disturbing fact filtered through captured, corrupted individuals and scrawled bloody markings upon walls. They could not progress too far into the higher hive spires, for those who did were always lost. An extremely disturbing reality became apparent, however. The truth was, heretic Astartes were here on Vigilus, in the form of raptors, warp talons and helldrakes, seemingly led by an appropriately titled individual, Harken Worldclaimer, Herald of the Apocalypse. Such things did not bode well for the Imperial's hopes of restoring Vigilus to a state of order and defensive security, so when Worldclaimer's voice echoed across the planet, it surely proved terrifying. But the bleakness of the picture it painted in the minds of mortals of the absolute hell that was still yet to come turned many stomachs over, despite the presence of the Emperors Astartes and Marneus Calgar. Throughout every hive sprawl and slum on Vigilus, crackled, distorted and garbled messages spewed from Vox units. They were difficult to understand, but clear enough to get the message. Harken Worldclaimer made sure that his ominous message was spread to every corner of the world.
Response. It is claimed in the name of Abaddon, the spoiler of worlds. Know that you will kneel before him, or you will burn.
Vigilus became a site of critical importance as a world that was soon to feel the spiralling death toll of planetary-scale hive war. Like so many Imperial planets who maintain a facade of order and discipline, this was shattered overnight, and by the cold light of day, only the reality of systematic corruption and ineptitude remained. Another critical flaw that was quickly exposed lay in the fact that each hive sprawl on Vigilus relied on at least one of the others for a commodity, without which it could not function. And this seems to have been a very serious oversight when some form of disaster occurred within one or multiple hive sprawls, such as a contagion or a war. This reliance meant it were far easier for the cultists to cripple multiple cities at once as soon as they had some influence over governors of the cities themselves or the planetary council. And in a broader sense, Vigilus is perhaps an excellent example and analogy for what has befallen humanity many times in its history, in the sense of building reliance upon distant resources that could at any time, for many reasons, be disrupted severely. It was once a major reason for the massive collapse of human galactic civilizations during the Age of Strife, just as much as it had been a trigger cause in the ancient civilizations of humanity on Terra. So it seems strange, although not entirely surprising, to see humanity not having learned lessons, because learning lessons from past history is not something humanity is very well known for, not least because it requires both history to be accurately documented and then also having people open-minded and objective enough to understand why things should be done differently and rationalised to ensure such disasters do not happen again. Any brief look at any point in human history demonstrates quite readily that this is not our strong suit. So despite deploying Marneus Calgar himself to resolve the situation on Vigilus, they had found themselves facing multiple enemies requiring a broad swath of tactical solutions. The Astartes faced enemies at every turn, and even at one point the Senate chambers were breached from above, forcing the Ultramarines to engage against the forces of Chaos, who were by now corrupting the planet in a dozen different ways. Meanwhile, the Imperials continued to face off against Drakari, Orcs, the Eldari, and of course Genestealer cultists. Many of the Imperial forces were by now only what could be described as tattered remnants of their former selves, nothing that could stand up to an almost unrelenting assault, often from enemies who were wielding forces and weaponry far above their ability to defend against. On top of all of this, the populace were often being stretched to the limit in providing production and resources, relying upon heavily damaged infrastructure and attempting to fill the gaps by workers being pushed to their absolute limit. Many dying where they stood, insurrections and rioting began to take place. Some were workers who could just not see the victory in being thrashed to death at Imperial workstations, and others were clearly just losing hope or in a dazed state of panic and rage that it had all come to this, and that their fates may well already be sealed. But it was when those corrupted communications began to drift into every hab, every factorum and dark transit station, when the haunted, grumbled whispers and vox exclamations began to penetrate the senses of the populace, that the mood of the planet shifted in a negative direction. Worse, that they were bleak, suggestive, and detailing the approaching fate of all. Sometimes barely audible, other times overwhelming shrieking that cut through human nerves like a white-hot blade. The unrelenting barrage of work, reality, and distressing, inescapable vox messaging from the void were making life for the billions of human citizens who remained trapped in their hive cities intolerable. Cohesion was disintegrating at every level, trust in authorities was nearly extinguished, and the Imperial forces of the Militarum, Sororitas, Mechanicus and Astartes were heavily outnumbered, and just generally diminished by the grinding multi-enemy, multi-approach war that was being fought in every corner of their territory. Despite the deployment and intervention of multiple Astartes forces, the presence of Calgar himself, the situation was starting to look legitimately unsalvageable. Far from seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, for any who looked to the heavens above, all that could be seen was darkness. Quite literally pure darkness, so consuming that it entered the minds of all and twisted them into corrupted minions of the dark entities of the void. The defenders of Vigilus faced obliteration with the oncoming forces of Abaddon, who was apparently arriving to the world at any time now. How could the citizens and Imperials of Vigilus prevail against such all-encompassing darkness, against such reckless hate?